Hey everyone, my name is Jack, and I wanted to go over the very important decision that is renting versus buying your primary residence. When it comes to living anywhere, you ultimately have two choices: to rent or to buy your home. This decision to rent versus own is one that should be very carefully considered, and it depends on a variety of factors that are specific to your circumstances, whether it be your financial goals, your accessibility to a good market, among many other things. But before you can make the best decision between renting versus owning, we have to understand the advantages and disadvantages of both. Let's start with the advantages of renting. The biggest single advantage of renting is the flexibility that it gives you. Most residential leases are at most 12 months, and many are month to month, so you have a lot more flexibility in being able to move places very quickly at the end of your lease term. Compare this to owning a home, where it often takes months, if not years even, depending on your market, to sell that home. This is a very quick alternative to being able to pick up your bags and leave quickly without having all this extra financial weight behind you. In short, compared to owning, you're not financially locked to a location when you rent. On a similar note, renting is very cheap in the short run compared to owning a home. When you rent, all you have to do is pay the monthly expenses, that is rent, maybe utilities depending on the structure of your lease, and that's pretty much it. Whereas with owning, you're going to have a lot more expenses that you have to both pay up front and as you go along. That's not the case with renting. Renting is almost always way more convenient than owning a home as well, since you're not the one who has to take care of the roof, the HVAC system, the common area expenses, among many other things. That's primarily the landlord's responsibility. Of course, some leases do specify that tenants have to take care of certain parts of the property, but ultimately it's probably going to be way cheaper than if you actually owned the whole building outright to maintain it. Now let's take a look at the disadvantages of renting. While it might be cheaper in the short run, renting is typically much more expensive over the long run. When you rent forever, you pay rent forever. You don't build any equity as you would if you owned the building, and that's very expensive over the long term, since having that flexibility that we mentioned earlier comes with a premium. If instead of paying rent for 30 years, you put all those payments toward a mortgage instead, at the end of those 30 years, you would have a paid off property, which would greatly decrease your housing expenses, which is something you don't get when you rent over the long term. And to that note, another disadvantage is not having any equity when you rent. Simply put, when you pay rent, you don't get the money back. The landlord's taking that rent payment, and when you move out, you're not getting any of that back. Maybe you'll have a security deposit that you get back and might feel like you're getting paid again, but you probably shouldn't count on that either.
What? This is outrageous. It's unfair.
When you pay rent, what you're paying is to your landlord, not to anything that you actually own. Another significant disadvantage with renting is that there are very few tax advantages to renting, if any at all. Compared to homeowners, who often get mortgage interest deductions, among many other tax advantages, when you rent, that is not deductible generally, unless you can somehow spin it into a business expense, but that's unlikely if it's your primary residence. So you do not get those same sweet tax benefits that you would with typical home ownership. Now that we have a general idea of the advantages and disadvantages of renting, let's take a look at the other side, home ownership. Home ownership comes with some very significant advantages, one of which I've mentioned already, and that's equity that you build in the property. Unlike renting, when you own the building, you own equity in it, and as you pay down a mortgage over time, you continue to build equity with it. And as the building appreciates in value, you get to keep that as equity. When you finally go to sell the building, you get to keep that equity with it. Or if you don't want to sell it, you can also borrow against it using a home equity line of credit or a home equity loan, among other debt products that you can use the home as collateral for. Equity is the single greatest advantage to home ownership, just as the flexibility is the single greatest advantage to renting. However, another advantage to home ownership is, in a way, flexibility, and that's that you can customize your home as you see fit. Most leases are going to have restrictions on what you can change in the unit, but with the home that you own, you can probably do whatever you want to it. Maybe if you're in a condo association, things could get different, but typically you can change the layout of the home however you want when you own it. This allows you to make upgrades to the home to improve the value and increase your equity even further, or simply just to make it your own and make it more enjoyable for yourself. As I also mentioned before, homeownership also comes with a variety of tax advantages. Of course, you should always check with a licensed financial professional, or specifically an accountant, to make sure that you do get these advantages, but typically you'll be able to deduct all of your mortgage interest on your primary residence, And often, you won't have to pay capital gains taxes on your primary residence if you stay in it for a number of years. You can also deduct at least a portion of your property tax bill off of your federal taxes, which is another advantage that you can't get with renting. I should mention that tax laws are always subject to change, so be careful when assuming that some of these benefits apply, as often they may change in a given tax year. Now, another huge advantage to owning your home is the ability to rent it out. If you decide to move out of your home for any reason, you still have that asset there that you can rent out to a prospective tenant. Similarly, if you have extra rooms or if you buy a duplex or a triplex and live in one of the units, you can rent out that extra space to offset the costs of your housing. This is called house hacking, which is something I'm very fond of. With house hacking, I've been able to offset most of my housing costs with roommate rent since I bought a place that was a little bit too big for myself intentionally with the intent to rent it out. While you could theoretically do this with a big apartment as well, where you rent out other rooms, this can get a little dicey if leases restrict subleasing or have rules that would prevent it, so you have to be pretty careful when you're doing that. But when you own the place outright, you have a lot of flexibility in actually renting things out. Even though all of these benefits are pretty awesome, homeownership does, of course, come with its own disadvantages. Perhaps the biggest disadvantage is the fact that homeownership is expensive, especially up front. It can cost a lot of money to buy a property, even when it's leveraged with something like a 3.5% down payment through an FHA loan, since it's still thousands of dollars on a $100,000 or $200,000 home. With rent, you just pay the monthly payment. You don't have this massive down payment at the beginning, which can be very expensive and box people out of being able to afford a home in the first place. Not only can the down payment be very high, but closing costs can be quite significant as well, and can be very expensive to the point where you might not be able to afford a home at a certain price point. Another major expense, this one is actually ongoing, are property taxes. Depending on your jurisdiction, at least where I'm at in Cook County, property taxes are super high and often go up 10 to 12% year over year. So you have to be very careful with that as well when you're buying a property, since you might not realize how expensive the property taxes can be. Thankfully, Cook County is a bit of an anomaly, so most of the rest of the country doesn't have such high taxes, but still something to keep in mind. Not only do you have property taxes to worry about, but you also have maintenance expenses that come with home ownership. Sadly, homes do not take care of themselves, and they need someone to take care of them. If you own it, that would be you.
What? This is outrageous. It's unfair.
Maintaining a home can be very expensive, especially when big capital expenses like an HVAC replacement or a roof replacement or any sort of plumbing work need to be done. That's very expensive and usually requires specialists to get the work done. When you're renting, you typically would just call up your landlord and they would do it for you. Well, when you own the home, you technically are the landlord and you're the one who has to front the costs. Large expenses always come up at some point, so homeowners have to save up and be ready for these large expenses since they are not going to be hiding forever. Finally, the last major disadvantage to homeownership is market risk. With any investment, there's always a chance that it won't pan out. This goes for buying a home as well. You might buy a home for a certain price, and then years later, it may lose a lot of value depending on the neighborhood that it's in or the market's overall characteristics. While this is generally pretty rare over the long haul, and that real estate usually does go up over the long haul over time, at least keeps pace with inflation, you still have to be very careful since some neighborhoods are essentially wiped out by recessions and often can take decades to recover to their former prices. As you can see, there are a number of advantages and disadvantages to both renting and owning a home. The decision between renting and owning is not as simple as you might think at first, especially if you have big life changes coming up or maybe big career moves down the pipeline. Renting and owning can both seem like they make a lot of sense, and it can be hard to pick between both. Whatever your decision between renting or buying, it's imperative to at least keep your housing costs manageable. Housing costs are often the largest expense that any person or family has, so you have to keep those under control. House hacking, like I mentioned before, is a great way to offset some of these housing costs by increasing your income. Regardless of whether you rent versus buy, take your housing decision seriously and look for ways to how you can optimize it to your financial goals. The decision to rent versus own can translate to thousands of dollars over the long haul. It can also give you access to the lifestyle that you've always wanted. Each person's decision is not going to look the same. You have to understand this for yourself and look at the advantages and disadvantages of either decision before you make your own call. Even so, remember that no decision is permanent and there's always something you can be doing to make your situation better. Either way, I hope this video helped you to understand the advantages and disadvantages between renting versus owning your home. If you found this video helpful, be sure to give it a like. If you have any questions that went unanswered, be sure to leave a comment below. Until next time, take care.